I am reading Chapter 15 of the Ballad of Lucy Whipple. Chapter 15, Autumn 1851, in which the men of Lucky Diggins take to courting Mama, and I take action. Cholera was ravaging California, and people took sick and died before anybody even missed them. What with everyone dead or dying, whole towns disappeared, like Rocky Bar over the ridge. Jimmy Whiskers said the trail from Skunk Valley to Sacramento was so thick with graves, a frog could hop from marker to marker and never touch the ground. Lucky Diggins was spared, no one sick, no one dead. Bean Belly Thompson heard somewhere that the cholera was caused by eating beans, so folks stopped eating beans for a while, but slowly we forgot or ran out of other food or just missed the taste of beans cooked up with hog fat and molasses, so we started eating beans again and still no one died. As the weather cooled, life returned to normal. Prairie and Sierra harvested the last of the corn and laid it in the sun to dry. I spent my mornings getting meat and boiling sheets, and such my afternoons cutting pieces for quilts, and making over my aprons for Prairie and Prairie's smocks for Sierra, and my evenings making pies. While I baked, I sat with Bernard, teaching him to read until the sky grew too dark. Our favorite books were those about lords and ladies and knights. We finished the last page of The Castle of Otranto one day, and the next started it all over again. But we read whatever we could get our hands on. Newspapers, advertising broadsides, legal announcements, anything with words. Bernard didn't get much practice, for we both loved to hear me read, but slowly he grew from passable to proficient, and what he lacked in accuracy he made up for in fervor, his particular favorite being highlights from Shakespeare. Bernard, I asked one evening, after King Richard's opening speech, you ever think about being an actor, like that traveling troupe that's over to Marysville? Folks might let me live here and eat here and work here, but that don't mean I can do whatever I want. No way, no how they let me on a stage. I blushed, glad that in the dark he couldn't see. I'm sorry, I said. For what? It ain't your fault none. I'm sorry for bringing it up, for being so stupid and not paying attention to what life is like for you. I'm sorry you're treated the way you are. Bernard said nothing. Mr. Scadder and Snooze McGrath started building a big new kitchen in the boarding house so Mama could feed more boarders. There were Mama and Mr. Scadder together every day, deciding where the kitchen was to be and how many shelves she would need. And there was Mr. Scadder saying, "Why now, you're right, ma'am. How did a pretty little thing like you figure that out? And Mrs. Whipple, I wouldn't let old Snooze go a whit further until I got your advice on this." Poker John Lewis came back from Sacramento with a sack of flower bulbs, yellow daffodil, purple crocus, and iris, the sure enough color of your eyes, Mrs. Whipple, ma'am. Mama's face shone like the sun as she planted them outside the door of the new kitchen. Then the gent disappeared for a week. Happens he went to San Francisco on the steamer Huldah May, and returned with a sampler that had Home Sweet Home embroidered in colored wool, trimmed with flowers and trees made of human hair. The next week Mr. Scadder showed up with a real glass window for the kitchen, and asked Mama, "What, Mrs. Whipple, ma'am, would you like to be looking at while your beans are boiling?" Belle Scadder had gone and married her lawyer fellow. "Guess this proves there's a lid for every pot," said Mama with a shrug, and now I had marriage on my mind. I feared Mama's suitors were exhibiting more than an outbreak of generosity and good manners toward a poor widow woman, so I watched carefully. Too many lids in Lucky Diggins seemed to be searching for pops. Dear Gram and Grandpop, it is October and my birthday, but it seems like Mama is getting all the presents. She did make me sweet honey fritters and we had a little party. Lizzie and Ruby Ramona came, and Mr. Scadder, Poker John Lewis, Beppy Barker, the gent who brought me Pride and Prejudice from San Francisco, Jimmy and Bernard because it was my birthday and I insisted. While others danced, I commenced to read and didn't look up until I heard loud angry voices over the sound of the gent's fiddle. I was afraid they were making trouble for Bernard, but it seems that Mama had sat down to rest at the end of the divan we made from sacks of flowers and a red plush throw, and Mr. Scadder and Poker John Lewis were arguing over who would sit next to her. The gent put down his fiddle and tried to slide onto the seat too, and then all Sam Hill, pardon me, broke loose. The gent shouted at Mr. Scadder, "I don't care a bean if you're the biggest toad in this puddle. I am to sit here. Not a bean, not a baked bean, not a string bean." "Vagabond! Rogue! Border ruffian!" were shouted as well as things Mama would never let me write and tell you. Suddenly Mama spoke, so quietly that everyone had to shut their pans to hear, so firmly that everyone listened. "Shame on you! Acting like rowdy children! Stop this ruckus or I'll throw myself in the river." It was as quiet as a tree full of owls. Now listen to me good. You hounds are sniffing around the wrong dog's tail. I am not hankering to be wooed, pursued, courted, sparked, or any such thing, and I am not in the mood to be marrying anyone. Anyone, she said, looking directly at Mr. Scadder, the gent, and Poker John Lewis, still with Mr. Scadder's starched white collar grasped in his fist. So your daughter is still a widow, and life goes on in Lucky Diggins, and I am 14 and near grown, although to most people around here I'm still little sister. I'm not fat any more, I'm taller than Mamma, and my yellow hair is now mostly brown. What I would have liked most for my birthday is to see you, but I thank you sincerely for the ribbons and the warm wool shawl. Most of the boarders went south or west as autumn deepened, and we rattled around in the boarding house with its big new kitchen. The gent hung around the house, and Mr. Scadder and Poker John Lewis came calling frequently. I confessed to Prairie my worries about Mamma and her suitors. Mamma says she is of no mind to marry anyone, but what if she changes her mind? What if the gent or Poker John Lewis promises her something so utterly wonderful that she cannot but say yes? Then she will say yes, Prairie said. Do you want someone sleeping and eating in Pa's place? Telling us what to do like he was our Pa? Taking up all of Mamma's time and attention and leaving none for us? Sierra said, I like the gent. He would be a good Pa. Prairie, mending socks, added, Jimmy Whisker says curly-headed men are industrious and make good husbands. Go dern, rip snortin' rumhole, and cuss dag blame dag diggity thunderin', I said later to myself. Why can't they understand? We gotta keep Mama single or we'll lose her. Without Butte to cajole into helping me, I looked for advice where I always looked, in a book, and I found it in an old ballad about the beloved of Clerk Saunders, who wore no shoes or stockings, nor combed her hair for 7 years in mourning at his death. That's it, I cried. Oh, Mr. Scadder, I would say, Mamma would never ever tell you herself, for it was a sacred private oath, but she is determined not to be courted or wed, but to mourn for 7 years for my Pa. She wears no gloves or cloaks of fur, and will not until its 7 years are over. I imagined this being true, and tears for the doomed lovers filled my eyes. Sometimes being so fantastical comes in handy. I told Mr. Scadder and Poker John Lewis and the gent, and for good measure Ripley Gurgins, who was known to be looking for a wife, although he was not exactly courting Mamma yet. I reckon they believed me, for they came around less and less. When autumn deepened, and even selfless men could not sleep outside, Brother Claymore returned and filled up the house with his big laughter. Even Mamma took to smiling and laughing again. One morning I chanced upon him seated by the cook stove. What the dickens are you doing? Sewing curtains for your mamma's kitchen window. Sewing? You know how to sew? Figure it's like darning socks. Put two ends together and stitch. And I've darned a lot of socks, he said with a laugh. There he sat, big hands like hams, pushing a tiny needle through rose-sprigged muslin to make curtains for my mamma. Seemed like another dog would be sniffing around, and this one had God on his side. I thought to try the Clerk Sanders story on him, but decided against it. I couldn't see him swallowing such a tale as easily as Ripley Gurgins, at least without talking it over with Mamma, so I just counted on Mamma not being in a marrying mood. But Brother Clyde's big hands and merry heart reminded me of Pa, and I found myself smiling at him as I started boiling up the coffee for breakfast. And that is the end of chapter 15.